Hey everyone, it's Kevin. Welcome back to the channel. So this is a new scene I just created in Blender 3D with Grease Pencil. So it's another 2D 3D scene that I wanted to walk you guys through. So this is a bit of a different format for me because I generally like to do project breakdowns. I haven't really done a lot of time lapses, and earlier in YouTube I used to do a lot of them. It's just that I think like a few months into it, I think just recording time lapses never really worked for me because I usually end up stepping away and then it's still recording, and then I have like all this unused footage that just takes up space on my computer. So I kind of stopped that and started structuring my project breakdowns a little bit more, but I thought it'd be fun to kind of record something going back to that format and try it out with this piece. So this one is heavily inspired by the one I did a few days ago. Actually, it looks very similar because they are the same composition and kind of same subject matter. So here I'm working again with plants, but this time I'm trying to experiment with one of my favorite genus of plants, which is the Calathea, which is actually what Calatheo is. Hey Calatheo, Theo. So I really love the patterns of this plant, and I didn't really feature this a lot in the other piece because I wanted to focus on that Monster Monstera, and if you haven't seen that one, I'll put a link in the description. But that one was really fun because I was experimenting a lot with the workflow that I had kind of built up over a series of months. That included a lot of grease pencil, vertex painting, textures, and fun shading techniques, and I really wanted to expand upon that in this piece. So here, I think a lot of the footage you're seeing right now is modeling, but I'm also working with different image textures, trying to get an overlaid effect. The toon shader is a texture toon shader that also incorporates vertex paint, so I'm able to get the textured look that I'm looking for, but then also have some subtle color variations. I also did rig these leaves. I'm starting with the first plant, but I rigged these leaves so that I could pose them in a position that worked for me. And this is kind of the same technique that I was using in that last piece where I just created a simple rig on these leaves, and it was just a lot easier for me to pose them and make them look natural rather than just something flat. I did use inverse kinematics for that stem, which is kind of just reusing this rig that I created in the last part. So once, the leaf moves, that stem would move along with it. And here I'm kind of just positioning all of those leaves together. I'm also adding some subtle animation to it. I'm not really animating them manually. I relied a lot on the noise modifier, keyframing the rotation in order to make sure that I just had that ambient movement. And a lot of this process was kind of going back and forth between Blender 3D and Photoshop, which is what I made those textures in. You'll notice that I think for this shader, I do have two kinds of textures that I'm working with. I did one for color specifically, and then I did another one as sort of an overlay because I wanted some sort of like an extra textured effect. And those I kind of just worked with black and white colors in order to get more detail. Before, in my workflow, I would generally use a lot of grease pencil for that because grease pencil does in fact support blending modes. It's just that if you have worked with grease pencil before, it is, which is a tool in Blender that allows you to draw 2D and 3D space. Its strokes are spherical, they're not really flat. And I really wanted the strokes to be flat on this piece, and so I decided to work with image textures because it gave me the look I was going for. The shader also has some sort of light effects. I think it's a Fresnel in order to get kind of that shine on it. And I also added phases to this plant. That was kind of the whole idea, was just to kind of replicate that same concept that I had in the previous piece, and then put that here. So this is a Calathea dotty. You can easily see the texture painting, or the vertex painting actually, that I'm working with here that helped me to color the meshes while also supporting some of the image textures and that overlay texture that I talked about. And here I'm kind of just creating some of the eyes with grease pencil, and using the sculpt tools in sculpt mode in order to adjust them. I decided to animate the eyes just blinking. I'm not sure if I have a lot of footage of it. I did cut some of it out. I kind of just very similarly made it how I did it with the other pieces and with Theo. So here I'm creating other varieties of plants. Again, I like this plant genus because there's a lot of different colors and a lot of patterns that I could play around with. And this was also an experiment for me to just see how detailed that I could go. So I'm just making some of those textures in Photoshop, trying to replicate what is seen on the plant, and then using the eraser tool to fix it up. And generally, I would just rely on adding these details with grease pencil, but I really wanted to experiment more with this workflow and see if it was something that I was interested in. And I think it's because I'm just so used to working in Blender and not having to switch to other programs. It felt pretty seamless just going back and forth and creating the textures and then, editing stuff in Blender. It did take a bit of getting used to, but I enjoyed the process. This was also kind of a test for me to see how fast I could create a scene, because I did take a little bit of a break from Blender for a while. So the Monster Monstera scene was the first time that I kind of came back to it and was like, okay, I'm gonna just dive into Blender again. But then I felt like it had been a pretty long time. So I took my time with that one. I think that one took me a few days, but this one I really wanted to just see if I could make this in like a day. And I was actually able to, which is nice. It was like a day and probably like a morning maybe. It's because I already had kind of that workflow locked in, a lot of the assets created, and honestly, it was just fun for me to create. I think that's what I really enjoyed most about it, was that this was a really fun process. I think I focused a lot on technique and experimenting, so this was a nice change. So one thing I want to draw your attention to is that a lot of the pots, I kind of wanted to make them a bit geometric, and that was just to offset a lot of like the rounded shaped leaves here. Again, this plant has like very round, very soft edges, and I really wanted to kind of contrast that with the pots. And although it's not really a detail that you notice, I really just wanted to make sure that, it felt different from the previous scene that I created. And that was mostly in shape and in color. So here I'm just editing that noise modifier again, and that's just to give it some subtle animations. I did end up creating, I think, about 4 different varieties of this plant, and that was, again, just to give it some color to the scene. I really wanted to bring attention to the really bright, vibrant colors of this plant. So I'm working with a lot of maroons, deep pinks, almost blacks, but it's like a really dark green, and really patterned leaves. Just wanted to make sure that I represented it here. The one thing about it is that this plant has 2 different sides. So on one side, it is the texture of what you see in the front, but underneath it, on the back side, it's maroon. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that. And so I painted the back side of the leaves with vertex paint, and I was able to get a color coverage or a color that worked, so that when I edited those the leaf positions, moving their armatures in pose mode, I was able to get more dynamic poses and make it feel a lot more natural. So here I'm just kind of positioning those leaves for the last variety. And I'm doing that by either moving the rotation of the entire object or by adjusting the bones in pose mode. I tried to, again, offset some of the color so it all felt pretty cohesive, and it didn't really feel like it was all just one mass. So I just made sure to vary them by pattern and by color and by size, so there weren't any competing visual elements. And I went in with vertex paint on the leaves in order to give it some subtle variations. So one thing about this shader is that I really wanted to incorporate that somehow to give subtle gradients, subtle color differences in the shader. And I was able to do that with vertex paint, which really added a lot of that dynamic coloring that I was going for. I didn't want things just to be flat, but I wanted it to feel obviously stylized, but also colorful at the same time. So, not just the main colors that we're working with in the plant, but then also like some hidden blues and oranges and greens. And so I did that a lot on the pots, and I did that a lot on some of the leaves, just making sure that I could bring out some of those undertone colors to make the scene feel really vibrant. So for that really silver plant on the left, I did kind of go a little bit more lavender with it, even though, that's not really a prominent color, but I felt like it would really contrast well with the bright hues that I had. So after working on the leaves, I then moved to working with grease pencil. I actually filled the scene up with the grease pencil strokes using those different brushes. And again, what makes grease pencil really versatile is that it's capable of blending mode. So here I kind of just went with the default grease pencil brushes that you can download in the Grease Pencil Tools add-on. And I used vertex color in order to change the color, but then also used blending modes in order to make it feel more like a texture overlaid on top of these meshes. And that was able to give me a texture not only for the background, but also, make it feel a little bit more 2D, almost like a painting. But obviously, I'm just trying to go for something stylized, and I'm not trying to go for something exactly like a painting, but I really like being able to have loose effects around because it just adds a lot more to the scene. Now, to get these strokes to look exactly how I wanted them to look, I worked a lot in sculpt mode using those tools to adjust the transparency and the width of those strokes, which makes it really handy, especially when you're trying to go for a style like this one. So here I'm kind of going back and forth between Photoshop and Blender, and this is because I wanted to add more details on the leaves. Again, like I said, I would generally do that with grease pencil, but it was a lot easier to make sure that I kept those details flat rather than spherical. After I was done with those 4 plants, I went back and started adding more to make it feel verdant. So I added these leaves on the top, and this is the same element that I used in the Monster Monstera scene, but I did change the variety just so that I didn't have a very similar look. Here I kind of just did that same process of using a shader, but there I don't really have textures on it. I just use vertex paint to change the color and then use grease pencil in order to add the details. I just duplicated it at the top and then on the side to fill up any empty gaps and just create this visual vine element to help frame the scene. Then I added some background elements like these hanging plants, and I did some with grease pencil and some with meshes. The grease pencil ones I was able to set to a different blending mode in order to again act like a texturing mechanism, so it added a little bit more detail to the background. And then I also added these meshes hanging down so that there was some depth. So I did some hanging plants and then some plants in the shape of Theo in order to tie it together. For these, I just made them the color white, which works best when using the hard light blending mode, and I just lowered the opacity and then made adjustments as needed. And here I'm just positioning them around the scene behind the plants. And then I think here I'm realizing that the backside of the leaves needs some detail lines as well. So I kind of went back and I finished the other part, and then that was it. One thing that really ties this together is the compositing. So for this is how I actually added the outlines in this piece. I think I do talk a little bit about that process in the previously, and so again, if you want to check it out, I'll leave a link. But that was able to get me a lot of the stroke lines around the different colors and the different textures so that they'd be a lot more pronounced. And here I'm just adding some vines in the front, just as some front elements to give it, again, more depth, and setting it to a different blending mode, and then animating it, adding some modifiers to get it to repeat. I think here I'm doing some last minute adjustments, adding more overlaid grease pencil objects, and I really like working with grease pencil in this regard because it feels more like a graphic design style, one that I am used to. So I like really using grease pencil to overlay it on top of the scene elements in order to give it a bit more detail. And here I'm just animating those string of pearls and, you know, doing the same that I did for those front elements. And that was it. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this and this format. I know this was kind of new, but yeah, I had a lot of fun creating this, and hope to see you guys in the next video.